right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Straight Science. Straight Science is an evening seminar series put on by University of Alaska Fairbanks Northwest Campus in Nome, as well as University of Alaska Fairbanks Alaska Sea Grant. And tonight we're coming to you from Nome in the Nome Belts High School Library. So that's a bit of a different venue, but we're grateful to the high school for giving us this spot right now. So tonight, before I do introduce our speakers, I should say both University of Alaska Fairbanks Northwest Campus and Alaska Sea Grant. We are public servants of the Bering Strait region. We serve all peoples of the Bering Strait region, which is the homeland and waters of the Inupiaq, St. Lawrence Island Yupik, and Central Yupik peoples. Getting ahead of myself. So tonight, I'm very excited because we have two of the experts on the listing and hopefully delisting, we don't know, of both ringed and bearded seals. And tonight's speaker is Jenna Malek. She's a biologist, but she is well-versed in the regulatory world of marine mammals in Alaska and the public, the harvest, et cetera, et cetera. So we're really in good hands tonight. She is the ring seal recovery coordinator for the NOAA Fisheries Alaska Regional Office in Anchorage. And you see the other person that's lit up is Caroline Cummins. Now, she is not one of the main presenters, but she is the lifeline call. So she is very much a regulatory pro. And if there's any question that I don't see how it's possible to befuddle Jenna, she will make a lifeline call to Caroline, who will come through. So Caroline, we're so glad you're here. Caroline Cummins is the bearded seal recovery coordinator for the NOAA Alaska Fisheries Regional, is it Fisheries? NOAA Alaska Regional Office in Anchorage as well. So we thank Caroline, we thank Jenna so much for being able to speak to us tonight. We're so glad you're here. Take it away, Jenna, and Caroline, stay there in case we get a tough question.
Great. Thanks, Gay. Can you guys hear me okay?
Brilliant.
All right. Okay. So thanks for the introduction. And I also want to give a huge shout out to Caroline for all of her help putting this together and for the recovery efforts that we've been working on. So just to check, our slides advancing? Yes.
All good.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, just double checking. I have bad luck with technology. So tonight, what we're going to be talking about is recovery planning, but we can't talk about recovery planning without talking about the Endangered Species Act. So we're going to do a quick overview of that. And then we're going to talk about recovery plans, which are required under the Endangered Species Act, what they are and what they do. And then we're going to talk about ring seals and bearded seals under the Endangered Species Act, or as I might call it, the ESA. And then we're going to talk about what we're doing to put together recovery plans for these species. So just a little bit of background, because I always like to know where somebody comes from and how they know what they're talking about. So I actually grew up on the East Coast of the US in Connecticut, and I spent a lot of time in the ocean as a kid. So I knew pretty early on that I wanted to be a marine biologist. And I eventually went on to become a trained oyster ecologist, where I did a lot of dirty work in the salt marshes for many, many years. But then in 2016, I had the opportunity to work on marine mammal issues. And in fact, that year I took my first trip to Alaska. And after a very brief overnight in Anchorage, I flew straight to Nome and spent about a week there, where I actually met Gay for the first time. I had the privilege to go out to Savunga for the day and to meet with some of the elders. And it was a really eye-opening experience, and it really kickstarted my career in marine mammals. In fact, I actually moved to Alaska in 2018 to work on a 15-month project, and here we are in 2026, and I've been here for a long time, so obviously I'm not leaving anytime soon. But then I started working with NOAA Fisheries. And like a lot of us these days, I wear a lot of hats in my job at NOAA Fisheries. And one of the biggest and most important things we do are work on Endangered Species Act consultations, or something that you may have heard of as Section 7. I'm also a coordinator for our marine mammal stranding network. I work closely with Gay and the staff at COERIC to report and to look into strandings of marine mammals. I do ring seal recovery. I also do North Pacific right whale recovery. I cover all things harbor seals in the state. And then I work on marine mammal co-management, where I work closely with our Alaska Native organization partners to co-manage the subsistence use of marine mammals. And just recently, the Ice Seal Committee had their annual meeting, actually last week here in Anchorage. And so I work closely with them on co-management of ice seals. And I also work on co-management of harbor seals and stellar sea lions with various organizations around the state. So a lot of different things. I try to do my best at all of them. So just a point of clarification that I would like to make before I get started is that there are two different agencies that manage marine mammals in Alaska, which makes so much sense to absolutely nobody. It makes just as little sense to the staff as it does to the public. So I just want to say that tonight when I'm talking about NOAA Fisheries, I'm specifically talking about the whales, sea lions, fur seals, ice seals, porpoises. I'm not talking about walrus, polar bears, or sea otters. Those are managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So if you have any questions specific to those, I can point you in the right direction on who to talk to. Questions on any of the other species, feel free to throw those my way. Okay, so the Endangered Species Act, or the ESA. The beginning of this act was in 1966, and it started off as the Endangered Species Preservation Act. And so this is sort of the first time that there was any protection for an endangered or native species. And we saw the Eskimo curlew get listed in 1967 under this act. In 1969, they amended the act and made it the Endangered Species Conservation Act. And really the big change here is that it prohibited importation of endangered species. And during this time, we saw all large whale species get listed in 1970 as a result of their overharvest due to commercial whaling. Now, the version of the Endangered Species Act that we know now came in 1973, and it did sort of three big things. It required that federal agencies consult on actions that may affect listed species, so these Section 7 consultations I mentioned. They made it so that plants and all invertebrates were eligible for protection, which had not been the case previously. And they provided definitions of endangered and threatened. So this saw, for example, in 1976, the first invertebrates get listed. There was a group of 21 freshwater bivalves. And then for plants in 1977, there were 4 endemic plants to the San Clemente Island, including the paintbrush that you see here. So the ESA in its current form is really great because it's the strongest law for protecting biodiversity that's ever been passed by any nation. And this very strong law has 18 sections to it. However, the only things we need to worry about today for this talk are Section 3 for definitions and Section 4, which covers species listings and recovery planning. So let's start with Section 3 and definitions. As I mentioned, endangered and threatened were defined in 1973. And so endangered is meant to say that any species in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. And here I have listed all of the marine mammal species that NOAA manages that are listed as endangered. As I mentioned, all those large whale species, but the Cook Inlet beluga, which is a small genetically distinct population here in Cook Inlet, is listed as endangered, as well as the western stock of stellar sea lions. And we're going to talk more about stellar sea lions throughout the presentation today, as they are a bit of a success story. For threatened, it means any species which is likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. And we only have a few animals that are considered threatened in Alaskan waters. There's the population of humpback whales that migrates between Mexico and Alaska each year, and then the Arctic ring seal and the Beringia DPS bearded seal. So moving on from definitions, we're going to talk about Section 4 now. And so this is species listing, critical habitat, and recovery plans. And for either NOAA Fisheries or Fish and Wildlife Service to decide to list a species, we usually receive a petition, either from an individual person or from an organization, that says that such and such species should be listed for such and such reasons. And what we do is, according to Section 4, we have to look at these 5 different listing factors to see if the species meets one or multiple of them. And so these listing factors are interested in things like destruction or modification of the habitat or range of the species, overutilization, such as commercial whaling, disease or predation, regulatory mechanisms. Are there even any mechanisms? And if there are they working? And any other natural or man-made factors that could be affecting existence. There is this case where if the fisheries, NOAA Fisheries or Fish and Wildlife Service realize that a species has decreased a lot in population, we can actually put our own sort of internal petition forward and do a status review of the species. And that could potentially lead to a listing as well, but that doesn't tend to happen very often. So there's a whole process of actually having a species be listed. And I actually went into this in my Strait Science presentation on critical habitat several years ago. So if you're interested, you could check that out on the YouTube collection. But for the sake of this presentation, we're going to just assume that we have a species that met the listing factors, it became listed. So what happens now? Well, there's certain actions that are required as soon as a species becomes listed under the ESA. The first is that take of the species is prohibited. And that means that it's illegal to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect the species once it is listed. So that kind of goes into play pretty immediately. And then one of the first things that we do is we put together a recovery outline. And this is a document that provides preliminary recovery strategy and actions for species. And it's sort of a placeholder until a full-blown recovery plan can be developed. Critical habitat is supposed to be designated within a year of listing. That does not always happen. And in some cases, it's either not prudent or not determinable, meaning that we just don't know enough about the species, about the habitat that it uses. And so we can't actually, find habitat that meets the definition of critical habitat. We also then work on a recovery plan. And this is what we're going to be talking about a lot today. And the other thing that happens is that interagency or the Section 7 consultations are used to prevent impacts of actions on listed species or their critical habitat. And so in order for a project or an action to need Section 7 consultation, it has to either be conducted by, permitted by, or funded by a federal agency. And so just an example of an action in the Bering Strait region that you may be familiar with that has undergone Section 7 consultation, that would be the Port of Nome expansion. Okay, so now let's dive into recovery. What do we even mean when we say recovery? What does this word mean to us, on the management side? And to us, it's improving the status of the listed species to the point where the protective measures of the ESA are no longer needed. And so here we have our sea lions again, and they are a bit of a success story. So in 1990, NOAA Fisheries, under an emergency rule, listed Steller sea lions throughout their entire range. So that extends, from Western Alaska and into Russia, all the way down into the lower 48. And in 1997, there were a bunch of genetic testing that had been done that indicated that there are actually two distinct populations of Steller sea lions. One, which is the eastern stock that exists to the east side of Cape Suckling or 144. And then the western stock, which is everything west of there. And using the recovery plan that had been put in place, the eastern stock was actually delisted in 2013 because it did meet the criteria, as we'll learn about in just a minute, of their recovery plan. So I'm going to be using the eastern stock and the different parts of their recovery plan as an example as we move through all the different pieces of recovery plans. So a recovery plan is a required document. We are required to put these plans together under the ESA, but they're not regulatory. And so this means that if not everything in a plan is accomplished, it's not accomplished on the time frame that we put together, nobody's going to get in trouble. Our law enforcement's not going to come looking for you. These are really meant to be used as roadmaps to improve a species status so that it can eventually be delisted. So these plans provide metrics to identify when recovery has been achieved. So what are the conditions that need to be met before we don't need to protect this animal anymore, or species, I should say. They help us to create and prioritize recovery actions, which we'll talk about. They help us to monitor recovery progress. We do a status review usually every 5 years for a listed species. And so we can look at the recovery plans and see, has progress been made in this recovery plan and how does that reflect in our status review? The plans allow us to identify potential partners. Recovery planning is something that takes a village. It's a hugely collaborative effort. And so NOAA Fisheries looks for partners and other sources of funding to help us carry these plans forward. And then recovery plans also help us with communication and outreach and doing things such as a Strait science talk so that folks know what's going on and what we're doing. Recently, recovery plans have changed a little bit. If you are familiar with any old recovery plans, they were usually a single document that contained all of the information that you needed. We now use a 3-part framework, and it has 3 separate documents, and it makes it a little bit easier for us to work with, because each document on its own can be modified. And so you don't have to modify an entire document. You can change each one as they need. And I'll talk a little bit more about each one here in a second and how those things can change. So the status review, I've talked about these. These are the who and the why. So who are the players here? Why are they listed? What were the threats to that species? And this is something that's a living document in that it's updated usually every 5 years. And then you have the recovery plan as the second document. And today we're going to focus on the recovery criteria and the recovery actions. So these are the what and the where. So what needs to happen? Where does it need to happen? And then the recovery implementation strategy is the how. This tells us how we're going to carry out those recovery actions to then help us meet those recovery criteria. Now, the recovery implementation strategy is a really flexible document that we can make changes to and update it in real time, and it doesn't need to necessarily go under any type of public review. But the recovery plan, if we make changes to that, it is something that goes out for public comment so that we can incorporate concerns and new information. And so that is a little bit less flexible, but it also has a more rigorous review process. So let's talk about recovery criteria. These are performance measures that describe the conditions needed for the species to achieve recovery and for delisting to occur. So the way I think about this is the criteria set up for us this future state where the species is delisted and they no longer need our protection. And the criteria are the things that are going to help us get to that future state. So help us go from listed, to delisted. Now, criteria have to be objective, meaning that they're unbiased, they're based on sound analyses, they're very clearly described, and then any assumptions or uncertainties are made clear from the get-go. And then they're measurable, and this could be either quantitatively or qualitatively, but essentially you want them to be clear and measurable to the point where 2 separate people could look at the same information and look at the way that it's measured and it's been carried out, and they could come to the same conclusion if a criteria has been met or not. So there are 2 different types of recovery criteria. There are population focused, which are not mandatory under the ESA, but are recommended. And these look at the population and life history parameters that indicate the species is no longer threatened or endangered. So this is looking at things like abundance, productivity, their diversity. And we're going to look at our eastern population of stellar sea lions here and use an example of one of their population-focused criteria. So it states that the population for the U.S. region of the distinct population segment has increased for 30 years at an average annual growth rate of 3% based on the count of non-pups, which means juveniles and adults. So thinking about criteria and how they have to be objective, well, this is very clearly written. It's very clear what the time frame is that needs to be looked at. So the 30 years, it gives us something to measure, which is the growth rate of 3% or even more. And it tells us exactly what individuals we should be looking at, because looking at juveniles and adults removes that life stage where there's high mortality, as in the pups. So this is a very great example of a population-focused criteria, and this criteria was actually met, which allowed for the delisting of the eastern population. Then there are threats-based criteria, and these are required under the ESA. And these address the threats that may have contributed to the species listing. So if we remember, there are those 5 listing factors that we had to consider in order to list a species in the first place. And so we're looking at habitat, overutilization, etc. And so these threats-based criteria identify thresholds that indicate when a threat has been reduced or eliminated so that the species can achieve recovery. Going again to our sea lions, an example of a threats-based criteria from their recovery plan was that aquatic habitats are protected through appropriate management measures to provide a prey-based adequate to support recovered populations of stellar sea lions. So one thing I forgot to mention earlier is that stellar sea lions were originally listed because of environmental variability that was affecting their prey supply, interactions with fisheries, and predation by killer whales. So this particular threats-based criteria talks about that environmental variability that affects their prey. And it touches on the threat of management and if there is adequate management in place. And so here we have making sure that there is enough prey as the population increases and that there's appropriate management measures. So this is another one of the criteria from the recovery plan that was eventually met and led to the delisting. Okay, so that's the criteria section. We're going to talk more about recovery actions now. So this is the how do we get to that future state that the criteria described for us. So recovery actions need to be site specific, and they address things like conserving, protecting, managing, restoring, and enhancing species in their habitats. They should be linked to the recovery criteria, but they don't necessarily have to be. And they should be either population-based or threats-based, similar to the criteria. So recovery actions can include things like research to fill information gaps. The little ring seal you see in the upper middle there with the biologger on it, that's a way for us to collect data on where they're going, what habitats they're utilizing, so that we can fill information gaps on how to plan for recovery. We can do monitoring, such as the bottom photo, which is monitoring for Cook Inlet belugas here in Cook Inlet. Enforcement can have to do with making sure that take is not occurring during federal actions. Education and outreach is a big one. So for example, the Hawaiian monk seal, one of the actions in their plan was to reduce inadvertent disturbance by people. And so education through signage was a way that they addressed that. And then when you have species with international ranges, you can also have recovery actions based on international coordination. So a couple of examples for recovery actions is that population-based, these actions meet the species life history needs. And so for our stellar sea lions, one of the actions in their recovery plan was to estimate age-specific survival rates and reproductive rates. And a way to do that is to put brands on the sea lions when they're pups. So that way, whenever they're resighted and photographed in the future, it allows scientists to follow where they've gone, what they're doing, to see what habitats they're utilizing, and to help figure out survival rates and reproductive rates. An example for threats-based, and these are actions that alleviate known threats that contributed to the listing, is an outreach campaign that was conducted or is still actually underway for sea lions, the Take the Lead, Do Not Feed campaign. And this was to reduce feeding of stellar sea lions, usually at like fisheries discard stations, where we ended up seeing a lot of sort of aggressive sea lions that were having negative interactions with humans. And so this outreach campaign has done a lot to reduce those negative interactions and make, humans and stellar sea lions have a better relationship. Okay, so then that leads us to our recovery implementation strategy. So this says, how are we going to do all these actions that lead us to the criteria? Well, how do we implement recovery plans? Collaboratively. So we need a full range of stakeholders and partners to be included in not just the implementation, but the development and, putting together this plan. So we need input on the criteria, the actions, the implementation strategy, and then we can all work together to actually implement this recovery plan. So you see there's a lot of different partners around the circle here, obviously state and federal agencies, researchers, NGOs. And here in Alaska, we have a really unique situation in that a number of our ESA listed species for marine mammals are also used for subsistence harvest or subsistence use by Alaska natives. And in many cases, we have Alaska Native organizations that we work closely with to help us manage that subsistence use. And so having those groups involved in this recovery planning process from the ground up is super important. And so it provides an opportunity to have an additional voice at the table. And if we don't have buy-in from these types of partners, the recovery plans are not going to work. So in order for us to have successful plans and to implement them, we need to have everybody at the table and have everybody on board. So once we form a plan, what do we do with it? How is it used? It helps to guide the implementation of recovery actions, helps NOAA to figure out where we have authority to do things and where we might be able to find funding. It helps us to encourage our partners to implement recovery actions. So for example, here in Cook Inlet, we have a yearly event called Belugas Count. And this is a citizen science event where folks go to stations all around Cook Inlet and give us a snapshot of where the belugas are on a given day to sort of look at their distribution. And this is a specific action in their recovery plan, and it's largely driven by all of our partners. The plans also help us guide development of mitigation for our Section 7 consultations. And we have specific measures, for example, for oil and gas that say, here are the things you need to do to ensure that you don't harm ringed seals that might have layers at the ice edge. And when we're reviewing the status of our species every 5 years, these recovery plans sort of lead that review, and we can see, have these actions been met? Have any of the criteria been met? How are we doing in terms of moving forward with this plan? So that's the very abbreviated version of recovery plans, and I will say that it is complicated. And Caroline and I have been working on this for several years now, and it's still something that we have a lot of questions about. So if you feel as though this is a very confusing thing, you are not alone. But now I want to shift into talking about ringed and bearded seals and our recovery planning efforts there. So in 2008, we received a petition to list ringed, bearded, and spotted seals under the ESA. And the primary threats that were listed in those petitions were habitat change and specifically sea ice loss, as these three species are very dependent upon sea ice for breeding, molting, raising their pups, that sort of thing. And so a status review was conducted for each of the three species separately. And in the end, it was determined that ringed and bearded seals met those listing factors, and they were listed as threatened under the ESA in 2012. If you remember, there are a whole bunch of actions that are supposed to take place once a listing occurs. And so here's where we are for ringed and bearded seals. The prohibition of take has been ongoing since the listings began. We did draft recovery outlines actually very recently, and those are still in review, but we do have them, and they'll be used as a blueprint for our recovery plans. Critical habitat was designated in 2002 for both ringed seals and bearded seals separately, but it was vacated by the court in 2024, and that action is still under appeal. And we're expecting to hear at any point now what the outcome of that appeal process will be. And then there's the recovery plans. We really kicked off efforts for this in January 2025, as I'm going to talk about on the next slide. And then our Section 7 consultations on these species are ongoing. And as I mentioned, we do have some very specific mitigation measures in those consultations that pertained to mostly ringed seals, but also bearded seals as well. So last January, we held a recovery planning workshop in Anchorage. And we had participants from federal and state agencies. We had Alaska Native organization representation. In fact, the entire board of the Ice Seal Committee was able to come to town and attend the meeting, provide some really instructive feedback, and give some great comments on things. We had folks from the industry, academia, NGOs, and a lot of other interested parties. And so during this workshop, which was only 2 days, unfortunately, discussions centered around the recovery planning process. So sort of what I've been talking to you about thus far. And then we dove into looking at criteria and actions. So during the workshop, we had breakout groups that we put together to brainstorm potential recovery actions. And to do this, we had obviously talked about it. We provided some examples from other recovery plans. And what I'm going to show you over the next few slides are some examples of potential criteria that were put together by the workshop participants. These are not finalized in any way. They're sort of a springboard for us as we move towards forming sort of the more official criteria. But these are reflections of the ideas and the thoughts that were presented at the workshop. So for an example of a population-based criteria, one of the things that were put forth was that body condition of ice seals, as measured by blubber thickness, lipid density, quality of oil, or other parameters, indicates that sufficient prey is available and is not limiting ice seal population growth or recovery. So remember, these are supposed to be objective and measurable. Well, it tells us right there we need to measure blubber thickness, lipid density, etc., in order to tell if the body condition is good. Now, one problem we might have is that we don't have a baseline for body condition, but that's something that could be addressed with a recovery action. So this is a great place to start for putting together a population-based criteria. An example of a threats-based criteria that was put forward was the majority of coastal communities have shore-fast ice during their traditional hunting seasons, such that 90% of coastal communities maintain access to healthy seals. So this talks about the threats, so shore-fast ice, and knowing that that needs to be there in order for seals to be hunted. We have a measurable amount, so 90% of the communities. We have ways of measuring ice, whether it's present or not. So this is a really great way to look at one of the driving threats and how it can be measured. So after looking at the criteria, we had the groups get together and brainstorm potential recovery actions. And we had a lot of categories of potential actions, and these range from environmental variability to, ocean noise, vessel traffic, fisheries interactions. But what we're going to show you here is actions that were specifically designed or developed for environmental variability and sea ice loss. And when the breakout groups came back together, we presented all of the different actions, and then we had participants rank them as to which ones they thought were most important to be addressed. And so here's what we came up with. The number one ranked recovery action for environmental variability was to sustain and strengthen the Ice Seal Committee to build relationships and ensure adequate input and expertise on ice seal management decisions. So obviously, this really highlights the fact that recovery plans, they take a village, and that we need everybody's help in this. And so strong relationships with the Ice Seal Committee means strong relationships with communities who are able to help us to fill in gaps and have the best information for putting these plans together. The number two ranked action for environmental variability was to conduct on-the-ground observations, so community-level input, to obtain more fine-scale data on sea ice, snow conditions to identify regional differences in habitat use across the species range. One of the big conversations that we had at the workshop is that there are folks across 5 different regions of Alaska that utilize ice seals. And they utilize them, different species for different reasons at different times of the year. And so there needs to be some amount of flexibility in this recovery plan to realize that one size does not fit all. And so this particular action talks about making sure that we understand habitat use specifically in the different regions, and that we're using the community as a source of information to fill in these gaps. So workshop follow-up, this was, a little over a year ago. And just last week, we had the opportunity to share the highlights of the workshop with the Ice Seal Committee at their annual meeting. And during that meeting, the committee provided us great feedback about the workshop and their involvement in the recovery planning process. And we have worked really hard to have the Ice Seal Committee be with us every step of the way thus far. Unfortunately, progress is a little slow right now, so we don't necessarily get to provide a lot of updates, but we have talked about how we're going to be working very closely with them as we move forward and involving them in some of these crucial conversations. So what about recovery planning's next steps in general? Well, as I mentioned, this is a slow process. And even if we weren't working on multiple different species in a time when, priorities are changing, this takes a really long time anyway. And so because we really, really want to get this right, we want to make sure the right folks are at the table, that we have buy-in from everybody, that we have actions that we're actually going to be able to carry out. This is going to take us a while, but we are working on it. So we actually finalized our workshop summary report, and we'll be sharing that back out with workshop participants. We drafted our recovery outlines, and we're hoping that those will be moving forward shortly. And we're going to be starting to work with the summary report to help us craft recovery criteria and actions for each of the species, because they both have different, life histories and things. So there will be separate plans for the two different species. And as we're putting these criteria and actions together, we're going to continue to have close discussions with the ICEAL committee and our other partners during this development process. And eventually, down the line, we will have complete draft recovery plans. Now, a lot of folks might be like, well, wait a second, I'm not on the ICEAL committee. I wasn't at this workshop, but I've got information to share. I want to talk about different recovery ideas. Well, there are several different ways that the public can be involved in this process. The first is that you are welcome to send us information at any time that may aid in plan development. We actually have a specific email address that's here on the slide that you can reach us at. And if you want to have a meeting, if you would like to have us talk to, a group of folks in your community, just reach out to us and we will get that set up, because we definitely are still in an information gathering stage at this point. Another thing that you can do is, once the draft recovery plan is released or is complete, it will be released for public comment. So you're going to see something that looks like this picture here of a Federal Register notice that says, NOAA Fisheries is soliciting comments on a draft recovery plan. And comments can be submitted by individuals, by organizations, by tribes, by basically any entity. And what we do is we take those comments, we collate them together, and then we will make changes to the recovery plans based on those comments before we finalize the plan. I can't give you a timeline for when draft recovery plans might be released for public comment, but we are going to make sure that when the time comes, that there will be a lot of outreach, a lot of announcements. We have contacts in the different regions. Gay is a great source of communication for us. She's great at getting the word out to folks. So we will make sure it is well known that it is a public comment period, and those are usually 60 days. And then the last thing you can do is get involved and help carry out some of these recovery actions and help us move towards recovery once the plans are finalized. And there's going to be a lot of different ways to do that. The recovery implementation strategy, which is that last document that we talked about, that's going to have a lot of ways that folks can get involved. And so at any time, if you're interested in helping, reach out to the different partners. You can reach out to NOAA Fisheries, and we'd be more than happy to get you involved. And with that, I really want to thank everybody. And I hope that you have a better sense of, the ESA in general, and then recovery planning, and then how we're moving that forward with ringed and bearded seals. This is a bit of a complicated process, but we're trying our best to take the right steps, get the right people involved, so that we come out with the best recovery plans possible. And with that, I would love to take any questions that folks have. And my contact information is on the slide as well.
And I put it actually in the chat too.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Kay.
So thank you, Jenna and Caroline. I hope you're standing by, because you're the lifeline if we get a good tough question on that involves the bearded seal. So or the process. So thank you so much. And this is the time when, as a Strait Science audience, it's lovely to put something in the chat, give some love to our speaker and our landline contestant on Strait Science tonight, because it's never easy to give a public presentation. And these guys are here after hours, and they've had a long day too, and they're performing and providing information that's very important for us and for the region. So show them a little love in the chat. And with that, I'll say we did have right off the bat a question in the chat. Let me get to it. And the question is from Rosemary. What is happening to sea ice density? If we are losing ice snow density, how does the denning material hold up? And that's a great question. Ring seals do make a layer, unlike the other seals. And so they're under the ice. And so that's a great question about their layer, their beaver lodge, you might say, for those who aren't familiar with ring seals.
So that is a fantastic question. And I honestly don't know the answer to that because that is more of a snow. Our folks that are doing the more atmospheric and ice studies, which is not in my office. I think I know somebody who was here who probably has an answer to that question. I might be looking at you, Rick, if you're still online. But that is definitely something we can take back and try to get an answer to. I apologize that I don't know the answer. Carolyn, I'm not sure if you have any insights into that.
Um, I guess, yeah, I don't have insights necessarily onto what is specifically happening with sea ice. I understand it's pretty different around the state. And I know Western Alaska, it seems like there's been some issues and changes in with the sea ice seasonally. So I can't really speak to again, yeah, the climate patterns and stuff. But I mean, you're spot on with talking about ring seal layers and if they don't have sufficient ice and snow depth to create their layers, they are at risk. Their pups are at risk, right? If they can't have their safe, protected habitat to successfully reproduce. So that is definitely a big concern with the sea ice loss for those guys. I think also if their layers are melting prematurely or they're not thick enough, that exposes them to the elements, but also potentially increased predation rates from polar bears. There's kind of a lot of downstream effects for that habitat loss. But yes, if Rick wants to talk about the sea ice patterns,
I, Rick, before you
yeah,
jump
or
in, let me
yeah,
just say that we had an example of what it was like. And Rosemary, this is the $64 million, whatever you call it, question, in part because, and I'll try to hand it off to Rick. But in 2017, we had lousy sea ice winter, and in the, by and 2018, just stunningly poor in the region, right? Open water at Gamble in February, open water at February at Diomede. And those following springs, the seals are they're still on schedule. They're not going to stop. What they can't adapt to the birth time very quickly. So what we had was many, many seal pups, ring seal pups, spotted seal pups, um, even occasionally the bearded seal pup that was, yeah, flooding at Diomede on Valentine's Day. Thanks, Rick. That was unprecedented, I think, the number of seals that were coming to the beach. And in the old days, you would say, if you saw an ice seal coming to the beach, you would say, well, that's odd. That animal is out of habitat. It's just not in it. It's not where it should be. And in 2018, 2019, or, those years of minimal ice, it became, there was no habitat. They were out of habitat. They had run out of habitat. And so we got to look at what happened. Those seal pups came to shore very often. We had a very, very big number of pups that's documented through the stranding network, and that was with the help of all the citizenry, the tribal residents and governments of the region that we're calling these out, as well as here in Nome, Coeric's subsistence director, and all manner of people all around. So that gave us a little taste. Those pups were actually not in poor. Some of them, the little pups, were coming ashore. There was no ice out front, so some were in poor body condition. We did have an unusual ice seal mortality event declared by NOAA in 2018 and 2019, due to starvation, when there was a whole bunch of factors going on that came after that minimal ice year in the ecology of the ocean. But having those layers be vulnerable to rain events, to rapid warming, to rapid movements. And I'm going to say this year we have an interesting year ahead of us because everyone's talking about it's colder, it's colder. We're having a lot of north wind right now. It's very windy in Nome tonight, getting windier. There's a lot of lenticular clouds. Diomede is screaming out of the north. We have much extent of the ice recently. But we've kind of learned out here extensive ice may not equal quality ice, thickness of ice. And I'm going to hand it off to Rick if he wants to say something about that, if that's a good lead in.
Yeah, thanks, Gay, and thanks, Jenna, for a very informative presentation. So, of course, this year is really hammering home. Um, you know, we have the Eastern Bering Sea spring ice extremely variable. 2017, 18, and 18, 19, very low sea ice. This year, we've got the most extensive sea ice in the Eastern Bering Sea since 2013. Although south of St. Matthew Island, that ice is very thin. It's not like the old days when thick ice would be pushed down by these north winds all the way to the Pribilofs. All the ice, or nearly all the ice south of St. Matthew is new ice. It's very thin. As soon as the winds turn around to south for a week, we'll see this dramatic loss in sea ice area. So, so from the Western Science side, we are able to monitor basically the aerial extent of ice quite well with satellites. But for the snow on the ice, the quality of that, there is just no substitute for local knowledge, local observation, local expert interpretation of that. Because as everyone is aware of, the way that snow on the ice is redistributed with the winds through the drifting, the way that that happens is very different when that's happening on thicker ice as opposed to that very thin gray ice where it can be easily wetted and turned into concrete. So that's not really something that we have any ability to monitor remotely. That is where local expertise is an absolute must. It's really the only way, and it's absolutely the best way to get that kind of ice snow quality information.
Thank you, Rick. Anyone else with comment, question on that? And Rosemary, on your question, are you calling in? Are you a regional resident, or are you calling in from afar? Or can you type in where you're from if you're comfortable doing that? No worries if not. Because you have a good question here. Can effort be made to reduce risk, and assuming here you still mean ring seals, during pregnancy and pup rearing by informing hunter trail development with preferred denning type areas?
So I can go ahead, Gay.
Well, the only thing I was going to say for that sounds like for us, and I'm probably speaking too general here, but in the Bering Strait region, our ice is so mobile because we have the currents, squishing in. So around Gamble, Diomede, once that ice decides to move, and it moves all winter, we don't have that serious shore fast, heavy duty ice as you find in the North Slope Borough, where you can have shore fast ice and the same seals come back to the same holes that are there from the year before and all that. So I'm not sure if that's a question from this region, but it's a great question, and it would be something that might be very useful if denning. I think that's a great question, and I'll leave it to Jenna and Carolyn, but I just wanted to provide some background there because that really caught my ear, seeing hunter trail maintenance.
Yeah, so I can't speak to hunter trails too much, but I can speak to development, oil and gas development. And as I mentioned during the presentation, we have a lot of very specific mitigation measures pertaining to ring seal and ring seal layers. And a lot of work is done to do surveys for layers prior to putting ice roads or ice snow trails in. There's a lot of active surveying once an ice trail or road is put in. And if any seals are seen within a certain distance of the ice road, there's a cessation and movement in terms of things coming back and forth, and they will be monitoring that structure until the seal has moved a certain distance away. That being said, you're not always going to be able to identify every layer, but there are definitely efforts to do that. And I know some of the oil and gas companies have actually paid to have surveys done with dogs that are able to sniff out ring seal layers and able to plot out to just see how many layers are in the ice in the surrounding areas to their ice roads. So in terms of that, there is a lot of work that has been done. As with everything, there could probably be improvements, but we're learning something new every day and trying our best to keep these guys protected from those activities.
Hopefully that is that you got an answer, Rosemary, that you're satisfied with there. You good?
Yes,
I did see. Oh, sorry.
Oh.
Go ahead, Caroline.
Oh, sorry. No, I was gonna say I could add a little bit to that. Yeah, again, we don't necessarily working with the hunting trails. I guess I always just assumed that the people on the ground probably know what to look for way better. But I know some of the stuff that Jenna was talking about with um, other types of ice roads and trails for other purposes. But some stuff, I know we're told to look for is snow drifts and stuff where maybe it might be uh, habitat that could signal that there's a ring seal layer there, but uh, or like pressure ridges, I guess potentially they utilize, but to make their layers. So I know there's stuff like mitigation measures we have to avoid areas like that. But again, as Jenna was saying, it's kind of hard to identify a den. So we have those dog studies, and then also thermal imaging to try to see if there's anybody in a den, any seal in a den. So it's hard to do. So that is something that honestly I think would be valuable to us, and working with hunters in the local communities to be like, hey, what do you look for? What should we be on the lookout for um, to identify those dens?
All right. Thank you, Caroline. And Sue Moore, I see your hand is up. You have the floor. Take it away.
Thank you. And thank you, Jenna. Great presentation. Thank you, Caroline. I put it in the chat, but I just wanted to say that I'm really happy you're working with the ICO committee. And I was wondering if there were any takeaways from last week's meeting, any priorities, Jenna, that came to the fore. The commission likes to try to be involved in these things, but neither Jackie nor I could attend last week. So any additional information you might want to provide on that would be helpful.
Yeah, Sue, are you talking about the meeting at large or specifically recovery planning?
I mean, takeaway messages from last week's meeting in Anchorage.
Yeah. So I think, and Caroline can jump in. She was there on the last day. There's a lot of really good information shared, a lot of good discussions, talking about, weighing in on the science that was being done and giving perspective on that. And then thinking more about, the directions that the ICO committee wants to take. There's some action items for doing updating some of their documents, like their co-management agreement, their bylaws, and those are some of the take-home things that we're going to be working on in the future, as well as continuing to have this continued dialogue between the ICO committee and NOAA Fisheries as we're moving through this. So it was a jam-packed meeting. There was a lot going on. But it was a very good meeting, and I think there were some really good discussions in terms of potential action items for the commission. I'm not really sure. A lot of them were ICO committee specific, and then some stuff with NOAA Fisheries. But I'd be happy to debrief you and Jackie a little bit more in the future. And Caroline, I don't know if there's anything else you can think of.
I think the main takeaway for me was that uh, people, the committee wants to be like, I guess I'm like, how should I say this?
Straight out.
Yeah, well, no, I'm trying to think because they want to refine, I think, their priorities and what is accomplished at these meetings and moving forward, what are the things they want to focus on, and what is important to them, and also useful to them, because sometimes it feels like they're just kind of told that things are happening and going on, but they're like, okay, well, why is this important to us? Is it important to us? Let's make a plan for it. So that was kind of my takeaway. It's not necessarily directed at NOAA. I mean, I guess to speak to Sue, but just in general, um, like what are our goals of these meetings? So I think it's an opportunity for, maybe some better collaboration and also identifying like action items that are going to be useful to them.
Yeah, that was more the center of my question. And I know these meetings proceed in their own pace and in their own way. And I'm just very supportive of the communication continuing to happen. And the commission wants to facilitate or at least, be on hand if we can help in any way. So Jenna and Caroline, Jackie and I may come back to you for, a little bit more, but we both were aware of the meeting and couldn't make it ourselves. So that was the source of my question, nothing more.
Thank you,
Thank
Sue.
you.
I have a question, and I hope it's not a tough one, but we do have Caroline. So, but that is when you mentioned the 5 regions of Alaska, I'm assuming you meant that have access to ringed and bearded seals. I would assume you meant Bristol Bay Borough, or how did you break out your regions? The 5
So
regions of Alaska. And
under
that
the
doesn't
ICEAL
answer my
committee,
question.
so under the ICEAL committee, they have the 5 regions that they have identified are the North Slope, the Manilek, Coeric, AVCP, and Bristol Bay Native Association. So they kind of base the regions around what's included in those larger in the regional.
So they're based on the tribal consortium. Is that what you're saying?
That's
The
how it's listed
regional
in
consortium.
their co-management agreement.
Okay,
I'm pretty
that's
sure.
good to know. So here's why I say this, and if you're from the Bering Strait region, stop me if I'm wrong here. But for us, the North Slope Borough, the Northwest Arctic Borough, which has Kotzebue as their hub, Utqiagvik is the hub, and then the next stop would be Nome is the Bering Strait Communication and Transportation Hub. We're not a governmental hub, and so forth. Bethel for YK, Dillingham for Bristol Bay, Unalaska for Eastern Aleutians. That kind of gives you the Western and Northern Alaska. So in our region, we do not have a borough. The Bering Strait region, or the unorganized borough, I think it's called. We don't have a borough government. So we have 20 tribes, 3 completely linguistically, culturally distinct Alaska Native peoples in the region. And we have 16 coastal communities that hold those 20 tribes. And it's a complicated for federal processes. It's tough because we don't have a sort of a one overarching thing. And on your slide 27 and 31, I was looking, and maybe I got it wrong, but there's no tribe. There's no tribal in those pages. I don't know if we can go back to those. And I didn't know if that was an oversight, or because for the Bering Strait region, right, tribal government is very important. And maybe you guys can address that. I don't know how that works, but if you can go back to page.
Am I still presenting? Can you guys still see my screen? Okay.
No. You got to go down to the share and the little
Yep.
up arrow,
Hang
and you
on.
should be able to jump right
I
back on.
wasn't
Sorry about that.
sure if-
But I'm glad you
Oh, no,
stopped
it's
sharing
fine.
so we could see you.
Yeah. Can you see that
20,
now?
I think it's page 27 and 31.
All right. So this is 27. Or were you talking about this one, Gay? Oh, hang on. Sorry, it didn't change. There we go.
That one. So
Okay.
I could see federal agencies, NOAA, state and local agencies, academia, scientists, NGOs, foreign government, industry, zoos, affected communities.
So that's
No tribal governments.
so okay. That's a really great point. I'd kind of been when I said affected communities, I took that to thinking about some of the tribes and the organizations that we work with, because those are the folks that are directly utilizing these species as subsistence resources.
Okay.
But no, that's a really great observation and something.
My eye went right to that, and I thought, oh, geez, that would be
No,
me. I would have left it out by mistake. Something like
yeah,
that.
no, that's
So
a
please
great point.
add. You might want to add tribal governments in there because it's really important because you're the federal government, tribal government. We have a lot of and seals are co-managed, right? So we're trying to, and then I think it was page 31. One more.
Sorry,
One
that
more.
one.
Participants were, no, 131. Yeah, one. Yeah.
Okay.
Participants were from agencies, ANOs, Alaska Native Organizations. Wonderful. And none of this is throwing shade on any of this. I was just reading it. Industry, academia, NGOs, and more. So would that be, are there, and I kind of know the answer to this, but I think it's important in the Bering Strait region that because I get this question a lot, from these co-management organizations. Are they comprehensive? Are we hearing from them? Is our tribal government being represented at that level? And I don't know. I get asked, and I don't know because I'm not that involved with the Ice Seal Committee. Trying to be more so, but to learn.
Yeah. So
thoughts on that?
the primary folks that we had from tribes were the members of the ICEAL committee, which for folks that aren't aware, they have a board of 10 members. There's one sort of regional representative who maybe sits with Coeric or Manilik. And then they have a regional tribal or hunter representative that, they're from a variety of different places. And that is not to say that they are fully representative of that region there, but, unfortunately we can't. There are some organizations that have tribal reps from every tribe, like the Alaska Beluga Whale Committee. But that's not the way this is set up. But this was open to the public, meaning that we broadcasted it to folks and said, hey, anybody who's interested is welcome to come. And we did actually have a couple of hunters, one from the Bristol Bay region, one from the North Slope region, and one from North Borough, who came to talk about, the hunting experience and how important ringed and bearded seals are. So we did try to incorporate some of that Indigenous knowledge. We had an Indigenous knowledge session to make sure that folks who weren't aware of the importance of these species, that they could get a better feeling for it. So we did have tribal representation, but we didn't necessarily reach out to individual, tribal governments to ask them to come. This was, unfortunately, we didn't have the funding to do much more than what we did. So we did try. We know that we can't include everybody all the time, but as a starting point, this being sort of the kickoff of recovery planning, we at least tried to get some of the right voices in the room.
Yeah, no, we appreciate all that you guys are doing. Both of you and the Ice Seal Committee is doing. I just hope that one thing to think about is how that's like a workshop summary the tribes may want. Is that something you can email to, I don't know if they want it or not, but it's just seemingly very in the Bering Strait region where there's a big emphasis on tribal government, because that's what we have, right? We don't have a borough. We don't have some sort of, and we have multiple ethnicities, multiple languages, cultural histories, everything. And that's just such a strong message I receive all the time. So I just wanted to let you know that that's something that I noticed, and maybe that's a Bering Strait phenomenon, but I know that the YK Delta is the same sort of for us, and both the YK Delta and the Bering Strait region, we have numerous tribal governments, and we're big, kind of spread out with multiple ethnicities, and I don't want to lessen that. I just would love to hear more tribal governments, only because I'm from the Bering Strait region and I've learned a different, live here. So anyway, that's very interesting. I really appreciate what you guys are doing and your answer for that. So thank you for taking that question on.
Yeah.
Maybe they can get that workshop summary too, and you can get a conversation going. I don't know. We can talk after too.
Yeah.
Some thoughts on that. Anyone other questions? I do have one more. Is one of your criteria do you have anything like this that would be, are seals adapting? Do you have anything that would show like, well, I'll be darned, seals are adapting because certainly the climate has changed, the ice has changed, the timing has changed. I mean, I can't imagine that the ship traffic's changed. I'm talking Bering Strait region, that ship traffic's changed, threats have changed, are multiplying. We have, don't forget, we're on a transboundary. We share the same stock of bearded and ring seals with the Russian Federation. It's getting more like old days. And less communication is available to us between those. Anyway, thoughts?
Um, we would have to make sure that it was pitched in a way that was objective and measurable. Like, is there a way that we could measure adaptation? Is there something that could fit in there that way? And we could also look at other recovery plans for species that are dealing with these changing environmental conditions and seeing if they have anything in there that would be along those lines of, are the species changing with the times, basically.
Yeah, like for example, say it kind of looks, data-free opinion here. It looks like the carrying capacity of the northern Bering Sea has dropped rather rapidly, right? The cold thermal barrier, it's highly variable now, right? So the marine ecosystem of the northern Bering Sea is getting a lot of pressure from the southern Bering Sea at times when that ice is very variable and those southern warmer fish can come on up and warmer predators and whatnot. We always looking at sort of the same old parameters, like, well, they used to have this many babies and now they're only having this maybe. But is there a different way to sort of think about like what would be and I don't have the answer, but just as a thing to think about, what would be the parameters to say, I think bearded seals are they're kind of adapting. And I would use to sort of look at that, I would look at spotted seals. Spotted seals were not here in the wintertime until about 2010, 11, 8, somewhere in there. I'd have to go look in my notes. And then the ice would come and we'd be seeing pulling spotted seals didn't know what to do. And they were walking out onto the streets, right? And now they're just part of the winter fauna here. So is that an adaptation to this highly variable situation? Spotted seals maybe their numbers aren't so much. I don't know. But that just as an example, like would ring seals, do we know, are we thinking about it right? And I only say that because I think I'm sure we are testing what we know and can get at, but I would put that question to maybe the Ice Seal Committee members, to our citizens of the region, kind of like what Rick was saying, bring it local. And people here have just a tremendous capacity to come up with new perspectives, that may challenge and may provide a different way of looking at things. And I just don't know what that would be, but I'm just encouraging that kind of dialogue with the coast. And that would be
that's a great
positive.
idea, Gay.
It's more positive. How are they adapting? Because I think we do see that some adaptations to these conditions that we did not have 20 years ago.
I was just going to add too, because Jenna and I were talking about this actually earlier today, because the threats landscape is changing, and like you said, in the Bering Strait region, there's a lot going on and things are rapidly changing. And so we were talking about, okay, well, how do you approach this? When initially we were thinking these were the threats, but yeah, maybe the species was fine, but also they might have different threats now, like as time goes on. So, and yeah, so it's like, okay, if they're hauling out on beaches, now maybe they're more susceptible to disturbance. or maybe disease, predation from other, maybe other animals. So, but we were talking about how, the nice thing about the recovery framework is like that last piece is the recovery implementation strategy. All of the documents are able to be revised, but that last bit is a little bit more flexible. So if there's like, actions that we're like, hey, actually, we need to go this different direction, we can be kind of flexible and adjust, as we get new information, um, adjust what we're doing. You know, if we're monitoring or we're seeing these changes and responses in the animals, maybe new threats emerge and old ones subside. We might have to adjust our thinking and when we consider a species recovered, or where we go the next step. So it's hopefully we could write it in such a way that it's flexible and adaptable to those changes, but we can also continue to modify what we're doing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's all good. Any other questions? Come on, audience. I see some good people on here. Could have some real good questions. And thank you for all your comments to our speakers. That was very kind and good. Last question then. Last question would be, since we have ring seals on and bearded seal recovery coordinators on, do you see recovery for ringed and bearded? They were initially put on the list for a modeling exercise that happened, right? The ice, they need ice. The ice was modeled to be much less and so forth as time went on. And so it seemed, I think it was prudent. Is that the right way to put it? To put them on the ESA. Do you see recovery or delisting in the future? Personally, I guess you can't give a professional opinion on that. But do you see a trajectory where that's a possibility even?
So this is
dear.
my where is my NOAA
Okay,
hat?
sorry, you guys.
Well, so honestly, but so this is why actually this is a demonstration of why recovery planning is actually really important, because I think delisting, like, okay, have they met their criteria? Well, we don't even know what those criteria are yet. So it's
Okay.
it's something to think about in terms of, like, we need to figure out what that future state is under which they would be recovered. And I don't know that we necessarily know that right now. And so maybe, yeah, I don't have a good answer to that question. I mean, I think recovery of almost any species is possible. It just kind of depends on a lot of factors. It depends on what their threats were, and one of the main threats, the environmental variability. I don't know that I see that going away anytime soon. So, but who knows? Maybe they can adapt and, live in a less ice-filled world. We shall see. I have hope for anything to happen. It's hard to say with how things are changing these days.
Well, all right, and then Caroline, because I put you on the spot a little bit too. Bearded seals, but you don't have to answer. I understand. No, it's a tough question. I was like, well, is there any hope? so sounds like there kind of is. Yeah,
Say no comment. No.
that's fine too. I don't mean to. You don't have to. Don't answer if you don't feel comfortable, and that's fine. You can just.
No, it's okay. I mean, I do agree, species specific, different life history, needs. Bearded seals, I mean, I think over in Russia, they're known to haul out on beaches and not use sea ice platforms for everything. So I do think that there's hope for them. I think the issue could become access to, prey resources, especially, because right now they really rely on sea ice over relatively shallow water so they can access benthic prey. So they still have to be able to, haul out, breed and pup and molt and do all their things somewhere, but also have access to ample prey resources. So if those things are maintained, I think they have a shot.
So if it helps, people on the original listing didn't know that ring seals breed down here. So they do breed and pup and do all that here. And know that bearded seals, it's not just on the Chukotkin side. Bearded seals are found in the summertime here, and they swim
Right, right.
upriver. They're seen in our lagoon system, maybe not giant adults, but certainly subadults and pups. And those guys are using our extensive lagoon system from southern Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, uh, northern Seward, I should have said southern Seward Peninsula, northern Seward Peninsula, and then up into the Chukchi, where you Point Lay and so forth. You have those extensive lagoon systems. But we actually have haul outs in the summer where where ring seals are hauling out, right? And where bearded seals are found up rivers, and it's not that unusual. So those kind of
Yeah.
things, again, at the local, regional level, we would love to have people like a biologist or a NOAA office here, or somehow get you more here. And I am kind of NOAA, so lean on me a little bit here. I am an Alaska Sea Grant is a NOAA national program by design embedded in land grant colleges. So I'm on the team as well, and the state team. So I walk in all manner of worlds. But anyway, just so you know, I would say that it's not all grim, because if you live here in the summer, you do have a chance to see ringed and bearded seals, as well as spotted, and occasionally ribbon. So
Yeah, it'd be really interesting to hear about that. Yeah. Like, or if they do start upping on beaches, or you start seeing adults up some of those river systems, that would be very useful.
right. All right. Well, if you guys can stay on for 1 second longer, we'll let the audience sign off. And I want to say thank you both again. Very informative. Like Rick said, it's a complicated system, and you listen to it and you think, but it was very helpful for my brain to hear it and to see that. And I'm sure for everyone else here. So thank you very much again for making sense of that process. It's always good to get an education, and that's what we try to do here. So thank you both so much. Next week Straight Science will be back on Thursday, March 26th, and it's going to be large whale surveys in the Bering Sea. So there's been the International Whaling Commission has done 4 different, they have a project where they've done 4 large whale surveys in the southern and northern Bering Sea and further north, I believe. So Jessica Krantz with the NOAA Marine Mammal Lab at the NOAA Fisheries Center in Seattle, she's actually on. So hi, I think that's Jess Krantz right there. Yeah. We get the Iditarod winners. We've got the landline person, the ring seal coordinator, and Jessica Krantz. So I'd say we have a good thing going here. So she will be giving us the results of those 4 different surveys, what they found, and she'll be comparing year to year with all the climate changes. So she's going to give us a really great presentation as well regarding the large whale distribution in the Bering Sea, including our waters. So we're very excited about that, and we thank Jessica. She's not a stranger to Straight Science, and we're all welcoming her back. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a good night, and we'll see you next week.